Let's go ahead and continue this. We are on this. We talked about these little pattern people that turn up into become adult-like creatures, and that's what you have under the word dynamic in your textbook when we talk about asymmetry. We'll continue that. There are other issues that are associated with dynamic influences that have to do with the neocortex. You have a paleocortex, you have a neocortex. You have a cortex, okay? And that cortex has some attitude and some things going on that we should probably just mention briefly in a course like this. Because, you know, the more I do with neurooptometrists and working with people that have tone and ENTs and neurologists, the more I realize that number 5 is a dynamic concept that to this day I still think, Rick, we don't integrate enough with. And looking at ways to enhance performance and outcomes by looking at the complete neurology of behavior, of psycho-physio behavior. Huge issue. And so I'm glad it's up here, Jen. I'm glad it's number 5 in the manual. And this motor area of our left frontal lobe and the anterior wall of our cerebral sulcus controls muscles on the contralateral side, as you all know, while the right insula area controls empathy and the left prefrontal cortex controls feelings of joy and happiness. You know, when I wrote this years ago, when I did this, put this course together years ago, that hasn't changed. That's the same sentence I remember writing then. But now as I look at the sentence, it has a different meaning to me. It has a real meaning to me, a clinical meaning to me. It's called behavior. And Heidi, that's largely because of our work. And I really cannot tell you how excited I am in my next ventures in life to really get in that and explore that more. I have 2 books on my desk that Jen can't believe I haven't opened up yet, and I promised her I wouldn't open up until I get my immediate things done on hearing right now that excite me so much. Decibels and the process that goes on between your 2 ears. There's a binaural activity going on that you got to have. You got to have it. And we could talk forever about that. That directly influences the way you breathe, or the way you pattern yourself to breathe would be a better way of me saying it. So I'll leave it at that. Big area. Then you got these obligatory things. They're called obligatory imbalances. You acquire them. You acquire an attitude, Chad. You know this. We acquire an attitude. We like putting our A on top of our F on our right side. We like loading our hip on the right side. We like pulling the F in the A on the left side. We like pulling it up. We like to simulate that. They're both giving you information, but Rick, it's being carried out in a formal and informal way that's different on both sides. We like loading our spine, and we'll talk about some of the research that you even have in your manual. We like loading our spine on one side. We like compressive forces. It helps us deal with this thing called gravity. Big concept. We like pressure. We like pressure on one side. We create pressure on one side. We decreate or deregulate or take away pressure on the other side. Cranially, thoracically, and abdominally, and pelvically. Chambers. We like it. We want that. It's our reference center. These are references for us. We inherently do it and you don't even know it. Pounds per square inch. Inherently. We want that. It's control. People who don't have control are better than those people who do have control. Excuse me. People that don't have control, I said that correctly, are actually doing better than those people with too much control. I'd much rather see somebody come in that is lacking reference than have somebody come in that has way too much reference. Because I've got to go back and, tantalize them to drop off that reference. It's hard. It's behavior. And these two numbers remind me of that because it's proprioceptive, kinesthetic, mechanoreceptor, Ruffini corpuscles, remember those names? Days, sensory awareness that gets into visual cortexes of your brain, auditory cortexes of your brain, sensory cortexes of your brain, that then is associated with motor, learned, acquired behavior. So when the switch kicks on for a certain thing you want with sight or hearing or taste, your motor control is going to be right there for you to experience it. You will be stimulated to breathe or not to breathe with things you like or dislike with aroma. This guy's all over the place, isn't he? Why can't he just stay focused? We're talking about the diaphragm. What you don't realize, Rick, I just talked about the diaphragm. And when we're gone, Rick, someday you'll be going to an aroma bar so you can breathe. Does that make sense to you? You don't even know it. You already are doing it. Some of you relax when you're around a cigar smoke. You don't like smoking a cigar, but gosh, I love that smell. I like that aroma. You've already behaviorally been adjusted. And if you're put in a position where and it has to do with pheromones, it has to do with everything in life. But I'm hitting one key point right now. Ventilatory activity is a compounded result of how well you like something. Does that make sense? If you don't like it, it's not going to happen. So when you put these people through techniques, they aren't going to learn your techniques if they don't see a result and they like it. If they don't feel lighter. That man said to me, I don't know what you did, but are these the same balloons I can get in Alliance? Okay. You know? Are you sure? Honey, do we have red balloons in Alliance? I know it's a different kind of a balloon. He was shocked. But it had nothing to do with it. He was euphoric. He was elated. And he had a response that he then dropped off because he now, for the first time, felt what we were trying to get across to him. And I know you can all do that. Number 7, repetitive overuse, traumatic events, all contribute to this compensatory strategy with appendages. And when you start using appendages to help you breathe, you should stop worrying about the appendages. You should then look at the axial structure. So I'm just kind of going over this dynamic thought process. And I wrote this 20 years ago. I didn't change a word. It was funny the other day, we had a manual that had one word on it that said bilateral versus right. And I said, Jen, who changed that? Who changed that? Poor Jen, she gets stuck with it. So I go to our archives, and it was changed in 2006 by no other than me. And I'm coming back in 2013 and saying, what was I thinking? So we change thinking processes, but this has not changed. It will never change because this is dynamic ventilation. Does that make sense to you all? So you remember, when we talk about dynamic ventilation today, and we talk about the diaphragm, if you're going through a diaphragmatic experience because you've learned it so well, you've done it so many times, in order for you to reduce that need for that compensatory activity, the first thing you should go after is how do you shut down an appendage. It's not how do you get somebody to breathe better. How do you shut down an appendage? Can you write that down? Diaphragmatic breathing requires appendage inhibition. Somewhere, you got to shut down an appendage. Because when that appendage moves, there's going to be rotation of that rib cage that's going to reflect maybe a state of diaphragmatic activity that you don't want. So remember that. So as soon as we get these ribs down, we've got to have an appendage attitude adjustment, because if you didn't change that appendage attitude adjustment, those ribs aren't going to stay down. And you'll see our techniques, Jan, reflect that. You'll see that. You'll see that build into it. This guy has an appendage attitude. Okay? He put a hammer in his right hand, and he roofs before he never used guns that pounded nails in. His company did not own an air compressor. Can you believe it? So what was he doing, Rick, all of his life with his right arm? At an angle, roofing shingles. And the poor guy was labeled with MS and dystonia, which he does have, by the way, because he overused his right arm. We're convinced of it. And so that's an attitude because of an appendage. Look at his right arm length. He doesn't have any longer of an arm on the right than the left. Does that make sense? And you know, if you ask the guy, Stephanie, does he feel like he's standing awkwardly? He'd say no. And he'd even look in the mirror and he'd say, I'm fine. You follow me? He would look at himself and say, I don't see that big of a problem. He can't look at himself in the back and he'd still say, well, take a picture of me. I don't see that big of a problem. Because, see, these issues aren't that big to people who have them. His problem is, how is what you're telling me going to affect the way my arm feels? It's dead. Okay. Message for this. Take-home message. He has a problem. He has 2 diaphragms that were in a state of inhalation at the time he was roofing that roof. He never breathed. He trained his diaphragm to stabilize his trunk at an angle so he could do what with his arm? He acquired dynamic activity with an arm with a trunk that always stayed in a what position? Static position. And until you give him dynamic activity with his axial structure and static activity with his appendage, he'll never come out of that. Well, Jonathan, I couldn't help him. He developed a motor cortex that said the new norm for you is not to breathe. And that's called dysautonomics, dystonia. And he's dystonic. And he's moving around. You see these people, and they have dystonia is one of the fastest growing neuromotor issues in the country as we speak. They are flocking to Chicago to be labeled with what? Dystonia. The question is why? Why do you have dystonia? What triggered your behavioral brain to reverse the way you move your appendage and your axes of your axiom, axis of your axial structure? What changed that? Well, we know one thing that changed it was ventilation. Because ventilation is neuro. Yeah, Mike.
So the difference in shoulder heights is mostly a function of the side bent position, if you will, of his thorax?
Yes. You bring up a good point. His arms are in a state because of the orientation that he's acquired for frontal plane activity. He's over-sagittalized himself by extending with this paravertebral column, and he's lost the ability to flex his thorax. As he lost the ability to flex the thorax, he then centered himself in a frontal plane, thank you, Mike, on the right side. And now his right rib cage is in a state of abduction. It's like abducting all the time. It's side bent. Those ribs are compressed. They're close. And the ribs on the left side are all what? Open. And that's his normal behavior for breathing. That's normal. He doesn't feel any different than if he was here, Mike. He would say, this is abnormal. So the product of what you see is somebody who cannot side bend to the left. And then let's take the last one, Mike. If he can't flex and he can't shift in frontal plane, he now can't rotate. And his ribs can no longer then work his spine. Because what rotates the spine? Ribs. Right? What rotates your spine? Ribs. Jonathan, when I turn to the right, ribs have to rotate my spine to get over there. But if Mike's point of him bending to the right is in the way, the only way I'm going to rotate to the right is with my SI, or how about this word? IS joints,